Imagine looking out the window of your $50 million fortress to see your maid willingly freezing in a brutal storm. Why would she choose the lethal, biting ice over your warm mansion? The horrifying truth hidden downstairs is about to shatter a ruthless billionaire's reality forever. Imagine looking out the window of a $50 million fortress wrapped in cashmere, holding a steaming espresso, only to see a woman freezing to death on your lawn, not by accident, but by choice. What kind of monstrous reality makes a person prefer the biting lash of an ice storm over the warmth of a sprawling mansion? I have spent decades observing the terminal illnesses of the human spirit, and I can tell you this: the most fatal diseases do not show up on an X-ray or a blood test. They hide in the swollen bank accounts and the pristine, towering glass walls of the financially invincible. When Home Hurts warmly welcomes you to a story that will challenge everything you think you know about success, power, and the terrifying silent cost of human cruelty. If you find yourself captivated by the hidden truths of our shared humanity, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support is the vital heartbeat that gives us the motivation to continue producing these profound, life-altering videos for you. To understand the cure, we must first examine the deep-rooted infection. Richard Hale was a titan, a self-made billionaire whose estate defied imagination. Imported marble, rich mahogany, and perfectly climate-controlled air created a sterile, golden bubble against the unpredictable world outside. Yet inside his chest beat a calcified, rusted organ. Decades of ruthless ambition and relentless profit-chasing had caused a severe emotional necrosis. He had come to view the people who scrubbed his floors and maintained his pristine existence not as breathing souls, but as invisible phantoms, mere background noise in his empire of wealth. But diseases of the soul rarely announce themselves with a scream. They operate in the silent, darkened spaces until a sudden, horrific symptom forces you to open your eyes. For Richard, that symptom manifested on a brutal, freezing Tuesday afternoon. Outside his floor-to-ceiling study windows, an autumn tempest was tearing the sky apart. The rain was as sharp as shattered glass, turning the manicured lawns into cold, muddy swamps. As Richard stood safe within his sanctuary, a subtle movement caught his eye. There, huddled beneath the dripping branches of a massive oak tree, was Maria, a fragile maid from his own household. She was sitting on an overturned plastic bucket, wearing nothing but a pathetic, paper-thin plastic poncho. Her violently trembling, calloused hands clutched a cheap container of leftover rice as the freezing rain lashed fiercely against her spine. It was a scene of sheer, inexplicable physical agony. When Richard pressed the intercom and demanded an explanation from his estate manager, he was fed a superficial, insulting placebo. The manager casually claimed that Maria simply preferred the fresh air, that she chose to endure the tempest rather than bother anyone in the staff quarters. It was a grotesque lie, the kind of lazy societal anesthesia we swallow to avoid diagnosing our own rotting core. In all my years of analyzing human behavior, I have learned one absolute truth. No one seeks out profound suffering without a desperate, hidden reason. Richard, a man whose entire business empire was built on seeing the invisible details his competitors missed, felt a sudden sharp ache in his chest, a phantom pain of a conscience he thought had died long ago. He knew he was looking at a symptom of a much deeper, more malignant infection festering within his own walls. The terrifying truth was bleeding out right there in the freezing rain, and he realized with absolute certainty that he could no longer stay behind the glass. Stepping away from the suffocating warmth of his study, Richard threw open the heavy mahogany doors and let the brutal autumn storm violently wash over his imported leather shoes. The sheer shock of the freezing air hit his lungs like a sledgehammer, a jarring contrast to the perfectly calibrated climate he had existed in for decades. He did not bother with an umbrella or a coat. He needed to feel the same biting lash that was currently assaulting the fragile woman on his lawn. As his expensive loafers sank deep into the freezing, muddy swamp of the manicured grass, the illusion of his absolute control began to shatter. When he finally reached the massive oak tree, the reality of the situation struck him with a visceral sickness. Maria was not merely sitting, she was vibrating with the kind of deep, bone-rattling tremors that precede hypothermia. The thin plastic poncho was plastered to her skin, and her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. When she looked up and saw the titan of the estate standing in the torrential rain, her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror, shrinking away as if anticipating a physical blow. In my years of dissecting the human condition, I have learned that fear is the most honest language we speak. She was not afraid of the storm. She was terrified of him, and of the invisible system he had built. Richard knelt in the freezing mud, ignoring the ruin of his tailored suit, and gently asked her why she was out here in the wrath of the tempest. Her answer was barely a whisper, trembling violently over the roar of the wind, but it cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal. The estate manager had decreed a strict new policy to maintain the absolute perfection of the manor. Lower-tier housekeeping staff were strictly forbidden from utilizing the indoor break rooms or kitchens during the family's operational hours, lest their presence or the smell of their cheap food offend the sensibilities of the upper echelon. If it rained, they were expected to find shelter outside, out of sight, like stray animals. Maria looked down at her miserable container of cold rice, apologizing through chattering teeth for ruining the view from his window. The sheer cruelty of it, the casual, bureaucratic banality of this evil, made Richard's stomach violently heave. He was suddenly confronted with the horrifying realization that his obsessive pursuit of a flawless, friction-free existence had inadvertently birthed a regime of absolute terror right beneath his feet. That fragile, whispered confession was the surgical blade that finally sliced through the thick callus of Richard's apathy, driving him straight into the hidden, neglected bowels of his own home. He gently guided the freezing woman back through the grand entrance, leaving trails of muddy water across the pristine, imported marble floors, uncaring of the mess that would usually provoke his legendary temper. Leaving Maria in the care of a stunned senior housekeeper with strict orders for warm blankets and hot tea, Richard descended into the lower levels of the estate. The contrast was physically nauseating. The air down here was stagnant, the lighting harsh and fluorescent, the break rooms cramped and devoid of a single comfortable chair. It was a sterile holding pen for the human machinery that kept his golden bubble inflated. When he finally cornered the estate manager in his plush, climate-controlled basement office, the air cracked with a terrifying silence. The manager, a man who mirrored Richard's own ruthless efficiency, stood up with a practiced, sycophantic smile, utterly oblivious to the storm brewing in his employer's eyes. When Richard demanded to know how long the draconian break room policy had been in effect, the manager did not cower. Instead, he offered a defensive, almost proud justification. He explained that efficiency had increased by 15%, that the aesthetic purity of the main house had been flawlessly maintained, and that the lower-tier assets simply needed strict boundaries to function properly. It was the exact same corporate dialect Richard had used for 30 years to justify destroying competitors, laying off thousands, and stripping companies for parts. The manager was not an anomaly. He was an perfectly calibrated extension of Richard's own philosophy. The terrifying diagnosis was suddenly staring Richard directly in the face. The estate manager was merely a symptom. Richard himself was the terminal disease. He had created a microscopic universe where human dignity was subservient to aesthetic perfection, where empathy was viewed as a costly operational inefficiency. The rot was not just in the basement. It had trickled down from the master suite. In my observation, the most agonizing moment in the healing process is not the surgery itself, but the agonizing mirror of self-reflection right before the first incision is made. Richard realized that his billions, his fortress, and his empire were nothing but a monument to his own emotional necrosis, and that a house built on the silent suffering of the invisible could never truly be called a home. Recognizing himself as the true architect of this misery, Richard did not hesitate for a single second to tear the toxic foundation down to the bare studs. He looked the estate manager dead in the eye, and with a voice as cold and unforgiving as the storm raging outside, terminated his employment on the spot, ordering security to escort the man off the premises without a coat or an umbrella. It was a swift, brutal amputation of the rotting limb, but Richard knew that firing one man would not cure the systemic disease that infected the estate. The true treatment required a radical, unprecedented shock to the system. Bypassing the normal chain of command, Richard personally activated the estate-wide intercom, a device he had only ever used to issue rigid demands. His voice echoed through the sprawling halls, the grand dining rooms, the sweeping staircases, and down into the dismal, fluorescent-lit corridors of the staff quarters. He mandated that every single person employed in the house, from the executive chefs to the lowest-tier groundskeepers, report immediately to the grand formal dining room. When the staff nervously filed into the cavernous, opulent space, they looked like hostages awaiting a firing squad, their eyes darting to the mud tracked across the silk rugs. Maria was among them, wrapped heavily in a cashmere throw, her face pale but her shivering finally subsiding. They expected a mass firing. They expected a tyrant's rage over the broken rules and ruined floors. Instead, they found a billionaire stripped of his armor. Richard stood before them in his ruined, soaked suit, completely abandoning the sterile podium of his authority. He did not offer a polished corporate apology. He offered a raw, agonizing confession of his own blindness. He dismantled the hierarchy right then and there. The hidden boundaries were abolished, the segregated break rooms were permanently closed, and the lavish, unused guest kitchens were immediately repurposed for the staff. But the most profound action was yet to come. Recognizing that trust is not mandated but earned through profound humility, Richard walked over to the grand dining table, pulled out a heavy, ornate chair, and gently motioned for Maria to sit. He then walked to the silver serving trays that had been prepared for his solitary dinner and began, with his own hands, to serve the very people who had been invisible to him for a decade. The radical surgery performed on that stormy afternoon did not just rewrite the operational rules of a billionaire's fortress. It systematically resurrected a dead man's soul. In the months that followed the great storm, the sprawling estate transformed from a sterile, silent museum of wealth into a living, breathing, chaotic ecosystem of actual human connection. Laughter, a sound that had been unofficially banned for years, now echoed freely down the grand hallways. The scent of diverse, vibrant meals cooked by the staff in their new quarters wafted through the mansion, breaking the sterile scent of expensive lemon polish. Maria, no longer a phantom trembling in the rain, eventually took over the management of the household staff, leading with a quiet, fierce empathy that no corporate manager could ever replicate. But the most profound metamorphosis occurred within the Titan himself. Richard Hale stopped looking at spreadsheets and started looking at faces. He learned the names of the people who polished his shoes. He learned about their children, their struggles, and their dreams. The phantom pain in his chest, the ache of a withered conscience, was completely replaced by the steady, heavy beat of genuine human compassion. I have watched countless men and women build fortresses of gold to keep the world out, only to realize they have successfully built their own pristine tombs. The terminal illness of the soul is always born from isolation, from the arrogant belief that extreme wealth exempts you from the shared, messy, painful reality of the human condition. But the cure is surprisingly simple, though incredibly terrifying for those who have spent their lives wielding power. You must willingly step out into the freezing rain. You must allow yourself to feel the cold, to get mud on your expensive shoes, and to look directly into the eyes of the suffering you have ignored or created. Wealth without empathy is just a different, more expensive type of poverty. Richard learned that true invincibility does not come from $50 million walls or heavily padded bank accounts. It comes from the quiet, radical act of recognizing the profound dignity in another human being. When you finally break the glass and let the storm in, you just might find that the life you save is actually your own. The story of Richard Hale stands as a powerful testament to the fact that the most impenetrable prisons we build are rarely made of iron bars. They are constructed from our own apathy, privilege, and emotional detachment. For decades, Richard reigned over a sterile empire, convinced that absolute control, ruthless efficiency, and aesthetic perfection were the ultimate markers of success. Yet, it took the agonizing sight of a freezing woman in a rainstorm to shatter the thick glass of his self-made tomb. He discovered that the very system he designed to protect his flawless existence was actively suffocating his own humanity. By stepping out into the freezing mud, firing the bureaucratic architect of that cruelty, and humbly serving those he once deemed invisible, Richard did not lose his power. He entirely redefined it. He dismantled a regime of fear and replaced it with a living ecosystem of genuine empathy. Ultimately, this narrative serves as a stark reminder that true wealth cannot be measured in offshore accounts, profit margins, or pristine marble floors. It is measured by our capacity to connect, to empathize, and to uplift those around us. When we choose to break down the artificial barriers of status and class, we do not diminish our own worth. Rather, we cure the calcified rot within our own hearts, transforming cold, isolated fortresses into actual, breathing homes. The ultimate tragedy of the human experience is not the loss of wealth, but the loss of empathy through the relentless pursuit of comfort and control. We frequently build invisible walls around ourselves, believing that shielding ourselves from the raw, messy struggles of others will bring us peace. In reality, it only breeds emotional necrosis. True leadership and genuine humanity are born only when we are willing to willingly step out into the freezing rain, to abandon our privileges and confront the suffering of others head-on. Wealth and success without profound empathy are just different, more expensive types of poverty. You do not need to be a billionaire to harbor a calcified heart, nor do you need a massive estate to inadvertently build walls between yourself and others. Look closely at the environments you inhabit daily, your workplace, your neighborhood, or your local community. Who are the invisible people around you? The janitor? The delivery driver, the junior colleague, the person serving your food. Begin applying this lesson today by actively acknowledging their humanity and inherent dignity. Look them in the eye, learn their names, and critically examine if any systems, habits, or conveniences you enjoy are making their lives unnecessarily harder. Step out of your curated comfort zone. Embrace the messy reality of authentic human connection and choose radical empathy over cold efficiency. Have you ever experienced a sudden moment of realization that completely changed how you view or treat the everyday people working quietly around you? Please respectfully share your story or perspective in the comments section below so we can all read, reflect, and learn from each other's experiences. If you found value in this story and its message, please subscribe to the channel. Your continued support gives us the motivation to keep producing meaningful, high-quality content just like this.